Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ESU Happy Hour. Tonight's presentation is The Anglo-Saxons, Present in the Text, Absent on the Ground, with Professor Robert Hanning. My name is Elizabeth Bigelow, and I am the Manager of Branch Services at the English-Speaking Union of the United States. And I would first like to give a big thank you to the Monmouth County branch, which is sponsoring today's Happy Hour. Ideas for our Happy Hour lectures come from you, our branch members, and other viewers like you. At the end of this program, you will receive a survey in your email where you are encouraged to share your feedback on tonight's lecture. This is also an opportunity for you to give us ideas that you would like to see in upcoming Happy Hours. There are some other notes about tonight's presentation that I would like to mention. There will be a question and answer session at the end. You may submit your questions using the dedicated Q&A and chat modules at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may also submit questions at any point during the presentation. However, do note that questions will be answered in the order that they are received. I'm so excited to share with you that we have over 250 registrants for tonight's program. And I would also like to give a shout out to the branches with the most registered members tonight. Those branches are Central Florida, New Orleans, and Research Triangle. And finally, I would like to introduce Dr. Karen Blair-Brand, Chair of the Happy Hour Committee and President of the Central Pennsylvania branch, to start off tonight's program.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Happy Hour. Professor Robert Hanning is a longtime friend of Ralph Windrum. Ralph Windrum is a national board member, and he is the current president of the ESU Monmouth County branch, who this program is being brought to you by today. And that's the branch in northern New Jersey. Professor Hanning is a professor emeritus of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. He has degrees from Oxford and Columbia universities. Professor Hanning taught at Columbia University for over 45 years, and he was a visiting professor at Yale, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, and New York University. He was the recipient of the Guggenheim, ACLS, NEH, and Rockefeller Foundation fellowships. He has published 2 major translations and 4 books, most recently, the Boccaccio, Chaucer, and Stories for an Uncertain World by Oxford University Press in 2021. Professor Hanning, I would like you to take the program away, and thank you for bringing this wonderful program to our ESU members, friends, and guests today. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. There we go. And good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Ralph Windrum for the invitation to address the English-Speaking Union today, and also to Dr. Karen Blair-Brand and Elizabeth Bigelow for making all the necessary arrangements so efficiently. And above all, I have to thank my wife, Professor Barbara Rossano Hanning, for setting up the PowerPoint display, which I think I will now get started with. Let's make sure I do this right. Share screen. And share and here we go. Okay. This is my title, as Elizabeth Bigelow told you, The Anglo-Saxons, Present in the Text, Absent on the Ground. What I'm going to speak about tonight is somewhat complicated in certain ways because of recent scholarly discoveries or archaeological discoveries. And I hope, therefore, that I can make things as clear as I possibly can. But there may very well be things that you don't fully understand because I haven't been clear enough. So please, please feel free to ask any and all kinds of questions, and I'll do my very best to answer them. Okay. As a young man, having just finished college in New York, I journeyed to Oxford in order to study, among other subjects, the literature and history of the period commonly known as Anglo-Saxon England. That is, the approximately 6½ centuries between the end of insular Britain's existence as a Roman province or colony and the arrival on the island of a polyglot army led by William, Duke of Normandy, whose goal was to rule what had by then become the Kingdom of England. This interval is widely considered foundational for the evolution of English civilization and culture across the succeeding centuries. Its characterization as Anglo-Saxon commemorates the invasion of Britain about 50 years after the Romans and their legions departed, which would be circa 400 Common Era, by Germanic warrior bands, primarily from the continental homelands of the Saxons and Angles, who, bound by an ethic of heroic loyalty to fierce, intimidating leaders, overcame the intermittent but finally futile resistance of indigenous British armies, appropriated for themselves most of what had been Roman Britain, and doomed the overmatched indigenes to destruction, enslavement, or flight into the western and southwestern parts of the island, soon given the name Wales in the language of the conquerors. By the end of the 6th century, the Anglo-Saxons had established in the portion of the island of Britain that they controlled some 12 kingdoms between the southern coast and Hadrian's Wall, the traditional barrier between Roman Britain and the inimical nations of Picts and Scots to the north. If you look at this map, you'll see that some of the names are underlined. Those are actually Welsh kingdoms that developed also between roughly the years 400 and 600 Common Era. The ones that are not underlined are the so-called Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The evidence for this scenario of Anglo-Saxon conquest derives from insular texts that variously celebrate, condemn, or lament this so-called fall of Britain to external invaders. My first book, The Vision of History in Early Britain, was an analysis of some of these texts in which I noted elements that seemed to me imaginative rather than documentary. Nonetheless, like the overwhelming majority of scholars of this period whose knowledge surpassed mine, I accepted as generally accurate this consolidated textual record of a clear-cut passage of dominion over what was to become England from Celtic indigenes to their specifically Anglo-Saxon supplanters. Fast forward to today. In a radically altered climate of historical understanding, this origin story has been fundamentally challenged, and among the elements of it most placed in doubt is the actuality of the Anglo-Saxon invasion or invasions, and indeed the very existence of the Anglo-Saxons themselves. How did such a seismic shift in our understanding of the insular past come about? And how, in turn, does it affect our assessment of key social and political developments in succeeding centuries, as well as of the cultural imaginings, what I called the vision of history, that often served to validate those developments? Offering answers, however tentative and incomplete, to these two questions will be the major goal of my remarks tonight. I'll begin, as I must, by attempting to explain how contemporary scholarly investigations have undermined the hitherto accepted narrative of Anglo-Saxon conquest and with what they have replaced it. This will involve some deductive hypothesizing, including a bit of my own, from new evidence that is convincing but also ambiguous. Then, building on this interpretive foundation, I'll briefly review the evolution across several centuries of insular political structures, specifically those self-identifying as English. I am, alas, not qualified to deal with parallel developments among the Celtic kingdoms dubbed by the English Welsh or foreign. The ultimate result of this political evolution was the establishment of a United Kingdom of England, albeit one that suffered in quick succession its loss of independence to a Danish dynasty, and after an all too brief interval of autonomy, its loss of insular sovereignty to the Norman Duke. To add necessary enrichment and complexity to this political survey, I'll attach to it an analogously fragmentary consideration of Christianity's impact on the culture, both material and ideological, of Proto-England as a result of the return of Rome, papal, not imperial Rome, to the island of Britain via a not entirely peaceful invasion that played out, especially during the 7th and 8th centuries, as a complex, often unsettlingly messy intersection of both systems and outlooks. Finally, in order to illustrate and dramatize this intersection or competition of both the institutional realities and, as important, the ideological aspirations, or as I have called them, visions of history, of ex-Anglo-Saxon England, my presentation this evening will be punctuated by texts and stories that, though they may deal with facts, are, in my opinion, even more important for what they reveal about this civilization's ongoing self-conception. The very human untidiness that runs like a theme through my portrait of this era stands in sharp contrast to the categorical certainties of heroes and villains, of celebrations and condemnations, often on display in the textual record of the so-called fall of Britain and triumph of the Anglo-Saxons. Turning to my first question, how could a change in our understanding of post-Roman Britain be so radical as to require the banishment from it of the Anglo-Saxons and their conquest? The simple, largely accurate answer is the development within the last century of new methods of historical exploration and documentation, including aerial photography, metal detectors, carbon dating of material objects, and DNA analysis of human and animal remains, techniques that have revolutionized the discipline of archaeology and made possible a new, more profound, and more accurate account of what really happened between the withdrawal of the Romans and the establishment, roughly 2 centuries later, that is around 600 Common Era, of what's now understood as a multi-centric, multi-ethnic, partly assimilated, polyglot, insular polity, bordered by communities of Celtic-descended Britons, Picts, and Scots, and controlled by warlords who called themselves kings and who spoke versions of an emerging insular language called English, Germanic in its basic structure, but replete with Latin, Celtic, and even Frankish elements. The gradual accumulation through these new scientific methods of details illuminating the material realities of this migration period, its new characterization, the facts on and in the ground, as it were, has increasingly revealed the inaccuracy and untrustworthiness of written texts that, with one main exception, originated centuries after the events they ostensibly recorded. Texts, furthermore, that constructed a past rife with elements of idealization, nostalgia, and self-aggrandizing propaganda relevant rather to the time of their writing than to the events written about. And there go the Anglo-Saxons, at least as we thought we knew them. My understanding of this period is shaped by 2 recent studies. Susan Osthuisen's The Emergence of the English, 2019, and Robin Fleming's The Material Fall of Roman Britain, 2021, but especially by Fleming's brilliant analysis. Both authors, using material evidence provided by archaeology, stress continuity in the agricultural and communal life of Britain's inhabitants through the 5th or first post-Roman century, on which stable foundation was erected an accumulation of short or longer-term changes involving commercial exchange and migration across the English Channel and the North Sea into and out of Britain. This meant that for Britons, during this time, as Osthuisen puts it, quote, incomers from across Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean were assimilated into their communities, unquote, by a largely peaceful process in which invasion by Germanic groups seeking to replace British society or government has no real evidentiary place. Instead, as Fleming puts it, in summarizing her research, quote, "It seems that coastal communities in a zone that stretched from southern Norway past the mouth of the Rhine and into coastal northern France and along the east and southeast coasts of Britain had come, by the early 6th century, to have considerable contact, and that the people living in this region were connected rather than divided by the sea," unquote. She adds, quote, "There are a number of advantages to rethinking and reorienting our understanding of the collapse of old networks and the beginnings of new ones," unquote, in post-Roman Britain. Among them that, quote, "It helps to defang ideas that changes in material culture in Britain can be explained solely by the Adventus Saxonum," that is the Anglo-Saxon invasion, "and instead allows for native British families as well as immigrants to be authors of the region's new material world," unquote. Evidence derived from the remains of material culture show that the areas once presumed to be devastated by Anglo-Saxons are instead the areas of the island most involved with Roman civilization and culture, where the kingdoms developed in which men saw themselves as English and then invented past for themselves. Nonetheless, this evolving culture included, as Osthuizen says, quote, "many Northwest European characteristics, including the depiction of the people of England as Angli, who spoke a language, English, that was dominant in the same period, and the restructuring of imperial administrative and territorial units in a hierarchy of folk territories," unquote. Since almost 200 years of meager, often contradictory written evidence lie between the end of Roman administrative rule in Britain and the documentation of functioning kingdoms in England, some hypothesizing to account for this political restructuring, Osthuizen's term, seems in order. I think we have to suppose the gradual accession to purely local power by ethnically mixed groups, often under some kind of Germanic leadership, that used the threat or reality of armed force to impose order and obtain land and resources within a circumscribed area whose limits were defined by a vague, possibly contested border with the next similar power center. The useful analogy here is with, as we've come to know them, Afghanistan's regional warlords, rather than with established later medieval monarchies, even if these local insular power centers, having stabilized and perhaps expanded, began to be known as kingdoms by the end of the 6th century. Here, from Fleming's brilliant study, is a material example that appears to shed light on this process of what I call warlord evolution. The key to Fleming's argument is iron. Much high-quality iron was produced in Roman Britain until the second half of the 4th century, after which a precipitous decline in the number of smelting sites and the consequent decrease in the amount of newly produced iron is proven by recourse to radiocarbon dating of extant metals. Lacking the skills or the resources to smelt high-grade iron, early 5th century Britons were forced to rely on recycled material instead. Quote, "Scavenging and recycling came to be the primary way those living in lowland Britain supplied themselves with workable metal," unquote. This was not a perfect solution, however. Quote, "For many classes of objects, cooking equipment, shield bosses, bucket hoops, fire dogs, recycled iron is perfectly serviceable. But it is a different matter for objects that require hard, sharp cutting edges. Scrap iron, when heated and reforged, does not have the strength of freshly smelted metal, and it would not have been possible in the early Middle Ages to make steel from it. Given the limits of recycled iron, it is little wonder that metallurgical studies of the knives and spearheads excavated from early so-called Anglo-Saxon cemeteries have identified many poor specimens," unquote. In sum, one of the many effects of the withdrawal of Rome and its technology and resources from Britain was a crisis in the making of blades that cut well enough to be used, among other things, as weapons. Around the year 500, blades made from higher quality iron and with steel edges begin to appear in some number of insular graves. However, Fleming argues, quote, given the state of iron smelting in early 6th century England, when swords began to enter the burial record in significant numbers, swords having been buried with their owners, it is highly unlikely that bladesmiths working there, that is in 6th century England, would have been able to get hold of the variety of freshly smelted iron alloy bars they needed from indigenous sources. Instead, they were probably procuring iron from traders who were bringing it in from the continent where, as we have seen, quite large-scale smelting concerns still operated, unquote. In addition to Frankish sources, quote, impressive amounts of iron were also being smelted in the lowlands and in southern Scandinavia. Here, archaeologists have uncovered a number of hoards of smallish, standard-sized iron bars, some of them steel, that have been smithed, with holes in one end so that they could be tied together in bundles for shipping. We know this material traveled, and by the early 6th century, there were people from southwestern Norway and Frisia nosing around the northern and eastern coasts of England. Perhaps, like the Franks, one of the things they were doing was trading iron. The main conclusion that Fleming draws from her research is that, quote, in the early 6th century then, at just the time when a steeply hierarchical society and elites were beginning to emerge, and when individuals and households in England were beginning to compete intensely for social position and resources, something clearly marked in the archaeological record, and in the decades when the possession and burying of pattern-wielded blades began to play a central role in this competition, the only people who were going to be able to stay in the game were those with access to imported iron alloys. Sorry, this keeps slipping on me. And in order to get their hands on imported iron, they needed something to trade. Of course, having swords must have helped them command the surplus they needed to get more iron. Although, admittedly, it seems that what we have here is a classic chicken and egg problem. Whatever the case, the point worth emphasizing here is that England's new sword-bearing elites were in the ascendant positions they were in, not because of ancient warrior pedigrees, but rather because they had access to trans-channel trade networks and traders, as well as control over economic activities at home, which allowed these people to exchange what they had for sought-after imports, unquote. In other words, the rise and flourishing of local power centers, maintained in part by weapon-enhanced coercion, was closely linked not to the ethnic cohesion of Anglo-Saxon invaders, but rather to post-Roman commercial opportunism. The next slice of insular time, including the 7th and 8th century, which succeeded this period of nascent socio-political hierarchies organized by sword-wielding strongmen, was shaped above all by two contrasting phenomena. One was the political institutionalizing of warlord culture in a multipolar network of quote-unquote kingdoms in which now one, now another achieved temporary dominance, an ongoing competition that I like to think of as a warlord merry-go-round. To quote Peter Hunter Blair's excellent, if now outdated, introduction to Anglo-Saxon England, quote, in these times, and indeed until much later, the supremacy of one kingdom over others depended upon the military prowess of the individual ruler, unquote. The other shaping force was the arrival from Rome of an evangelizing cohort that aimed to convert the Proto-English from their inherited, primarily Northern European religious beliefs and cultic practices to a Christianity that looked to the Roman Pope for leadership and orthodoxy. In the 5th chapter of the 2nd book of his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, Bede, the Northumbrian monk, who was the age's preeminent exemplar of Roman-oriented Christianity, as well as its greatest scholar and historian, lists 7 kings who up to the time of his writing, 731, had held the imperium over many or all of their fellow monarchs. The reach of these kings, to whom the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of which more later, gives the title Bretwalda, clearly marks them as far more powerful than what I have called the original warlords of the migration period. Still, their near constant battles, not only with external enemies, Britons, Picts, Scots, even Irish, but with their fellow Proto-English crown peers, or near peers, demonstrates that a united, self-identified Kingdom of England lay well in the future. Bede refers to these holders of the imperium not as kings of England, but as reges gentis Anglorum, kings of the English people, a title to be claimed by even the least powerful of the warlords turned sub-monarchs. The warlord merry-go-round only began to slow down when the Kingdom of Mercia established something like a stable hierarchy of power through the long reigns of 2 of its powerful kings, Athelbald and Offa, who controlled much of the English Midlands for 80 years, from 716 to 796. They were the heralds of a movement toward national unity that was both threatened and propelled by the first true invasion of the island of Britain, not by Anglo-Saxon warbands, but rather by a sizable Danish army, which made its shocking entry onto the English scene by its sack of the great monastery located on the holy isle of Lindisfarne off the northeastern coast in 793. My mention of Bede and Lindisfarne provides an entree into the religious revolution of our period between 600 and 800. In 597, a group of missionaries headed by the monk Augustine, not to be confused with the great saint of the same name who flourished much earlier, was sent by Pope Gregory to the court of Athelbert, King of Kent. Athelbert's wife was a Frankish princess, herself a Christian, whose entourage must certainly have included many co-religionists, and whose presence presumably rendered the king somewhat sympathetic to Augustine and his cohort. Christian beliefs and practices were widespread among the inhabitants of Roman Britain, but by the time of Augustine's arrival, the Christianity practiced in Wales and elsewhere among the British population of the warlord kingdoms had long been influenced by a Celtic version of the faith emanating from Ireland that featured an eremitic monasticism and owed no allegiance to the Roman Church or its pontiff. The arrival of Augustine, later appointed first Archbishop of the English, initiated 3 new areas of conflict. First, between Christianity and heathenism. Second, between Roman and Celtic versions of Christianity. And third, a less fraught but ongoing tension between monastically and episcopally organized systems of Christian governance. With respect to the first conflict between Christian and heathen religious observance, the situation was inevitably messy and unstable. Throughout the 7th century, the first step of Roman-sponsored evangelization was to convert a kingdom's ruler, who would then presumably enforce the practices of the new religion on his elite cohort, and below them on an unlettered and uneducated populace, which, being of mixed indigenous, and therefore Christian, and immigrant, and therefore largely heathen, elements, may already have developed folk religious practices that blended the 2 traditions. Such a mixing, when adopted by rulers, was not to be tolerated by the missionaries, however natural and nearly inevitable it might seem to our jaundiced age. Here is how Bede, in a famous passage of the Historia Ecclesiastica, excoriates Redwald, king of the East Anglians, for what seemed to the pious monk nothing less than sinful backsliding, although it might also be understood from a more neutral perspective as an exercise in hedging one's bets so as not to offend any supernatural force that could affect the outcome of the ruler's offensive or defensive wars. Here is Bede, quote, Redwald had long before been initiated into the mysteries of the Christian faith in Kent, but in vain, for on his return home, he was seduced by his wife and by certain evil teachers and perverted from the sincerity of his faith, so that his last state was worse than his first. After the manner of the ancient Samaritans, he seemed to be serving both God and the gods whom he had previously served. In the same temple, he had one altar for the Christian sacrifice and another small altar on which to offer victims to devils, unquote. Note, however, that in an early letter to Mellitus, a follower of Augustine, quoted by Bede, Pope Gregory advises that, quote, the idol temples of the English should by no means be destroyed, but only the idols in them. Take holy water and sprinkle it in these shrines, build altars and place relics in them. When this people sees that their shrines are not destroyed, they will be able to banish error from their hearts and be more ready to come to the places they are familiar with, but now recognizing and worshiping the true God, unquote. Is it too cynical to see in the Pope's advice an inadvertent invitation to do as Redwald did? As to the second conflict, the evangelizing efforts of Augustine and his followers soon encountered the Celtic-sponsored Christianity centered in what had become Wales and not oriented toward the Roman Church and Pope. There followed a period of disagreement over matters such as the method for establishing the date of Easter, the Church's major mobile feast. A synod was held at Whitby in 664 and seemed to signal the triumph of the Roman way, but, of course, Celtic Christianity continued to have a substantial place in the religious life of the island's population. It's important to recall that only through Christianity did Latin literacy and with it access to both scriptural exegesis and classical traditions of scholarship, historical writing, philosophical or moral analysis, and persuasive argumentation become available to the English. As the 7th century proceeded, a strong element of monastic culture obedient to Rome and the papacy developed, especially in the part of the island north of the Humber, and with it came an explosion of Latin learning. Two of the greatest Northumbrian monasteries were Wearmouth, dating from 672, and Jarrow, begun nearby a few years later. By far, the most famous monk fostered by these monasteries and their learned culture was the already mentioned Bede, subsequently famous as the Venerable Bede, who was born in 672 or 673, joined Wearmouth as a child of 8, and moved a few years later to Jarrow, where he spent the rest of his life until his death in 735, producing myriad theological and scientific treatises, as well as his masterwork, the already mentioned Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, completed after many years of labor in 731. The Historia remains a major source of our knowledge of the preceding insular centuries, but as its title suggests, it is specifically a history of the English as an increasingly Christian community. Accordingly, its stance is one of judgment, not neutral reporting. Bede praises monarchs who convert to Christianity and defend the faith and their kingdoms from the assaults of pagan rivals. On the other hand, he condemns backsliders like Redwald who desert the faith, and the partisans of Celtic Christianity, as well as others, whose calculation of the date of Easter differs from Roman reckoning. Even more famous than Bede's denunciation of Redwald is his story of the conversion of Edwin, king of the Northumbrians, 616 to 36, the outlines of which Bede doubtless learned from local traditions, but which he transformed into a superb example of literary artistry in the service of a perceived higher truth. Edwin, still a non-believer and heir to the Northumbrian throne, has survived the plot by the current king to kill him, that warlord merry-go-round, and is exhorted by Paulinus, a Christian missionary, to accept the new faith. Edwin promises to do so, but asks to consult, quote, with his loyal chief men and his counselors, quote, unquote, so that all can convert together in accord with how evangelization tended to proceed in those circumstances. This warlord entourage council generates two extraordinary responses, one offering a hard-headed, self-interested calculation of the comparative benefits of the old and new religions, the other achingly expressing a yearning for knowledge that would make sense of the double misery of life's brevity and human ignorance. First, Coifi, the king's chief pagan priest, denigrates his own unceasing service to, quote, the worship of our gods, unquote, despite which many of Edwin's cohort, quote, receive greater benefits and greater honor from you than I do, and are more successful in all their undertaking, says Coify. If, therefore, the new doctrines prove to be better and more effectual, that is, especially to me, we should accept them forthwith. Then another of the king's main advisors offers the following memorable metaphor, grounded in Bede's understanding or imagining of life in a warlord-ruled community. Quote, "This is how the present life of man on earth, king, appears to me in comparison with that time which is unknown to us. You are sitting feasting with your war leaders and troops in wintertime. The fire is burning on the hearth in the middle of the hall, and all inside is warm, while outside the wintry storms of rain and snow are raging. And a sparrow flies swiftly through the hall. It enters in at one door and quickly flies out through the other. For the few moments it is inside, the storm and wintry tempest cannot touch it. But after the briefest moment of calm, it flits from your sight, out of the wintry storm and into it again. So this life of man appears but for a moment, and what follows, or indeed what went before, we know not at all. If this new doctrine brings us more certain information, it seems right that we should accept it," unquote. After Paulinus, at Coify's request, further expounds Christian doctrine, the ex-pagan priest, in a lather of excitement, denounces his former cult and volunteers to profane its temple and idols, which he proceeds to do, riding on horseback and carrying a spear, which he throws into the temple to profane it, all actions traditionally forbidden to those of his priestly caste. Finally, quote, "Greatly rejoicing in the knowledge of the worship of the true God, he ordered his companions to destroy and set fire to the shrine and all its enclosures," unquote. If nothing else remained of Bede's encyclopedic writings, or for that matter, of the entire record of England's reception of Roman Christianity, most of which we in fact owe to Bede, the story of Edwin's conversion, made immortal by the flight of the sparrow and the manic enthusiasm of Coify, the ideal convert, would be one of the only two essential witnesses necessary to prove the extraordinary level of Proto-English artistic expression reached in the period between Augustine's arrival in Kent, 597, and the Danes' arrival at Lindisfarne, 793. The achievement of the other such witness is material, structural, visual, ornamental, rather than textual. Like Bede's narrative, it has a strong religious, more precisely cultic dimension, although the cult it somewhat ambiguously embraces is the one rejected and profaned by Bede's Coify. Finally, and with superb cultural irony, the beneficiary and probably the initiator of this monument, for such it is almost certainly Redwald, backsliding king of the East Anglians, bête noire of Bede. I'm referring, as some of you may have guessed, to the famous Sutton Hoo ship burial. The time is 1938. The place, the East Anglian estate of Edith Pretty, an enterprising widow who has become curious to discover what might lie beneath the large mounds dotting her property near the River Devon. To that end, she hires Basil Brown, an excavator in the employ of the nearby Ipswich Museum. Eventually, under the largest of mounds, Mound 1, Brown discovers the well-preserved outline of a ship, which I am now showing you in this slide. I continue in the notice that the wood of all the ribs of the ship has long since disintegrated. These are just their outline left in the clay soil of Suffolk, but marvelously preserved. I continue in the words of Sue Bruning, the curator of early medieval collections at the British Museum. Quote, "Amateur archaeologist Basil Brown famously made the discovery of a lifetime back in 1939 when he brushed away the Suffolk soil and revealed the richest intact early medieval grave in Europe. More than a grave, it was a spectacular funerary monument on an epic scale, 88.6 feet long, a ship with a burial chamber full of dazzling riches. As Basil and a team of archaeologists dug deeper, They unearthed fine feasting vessels, deluxe hanging bowls, silverware from distant Byzantium, luxurious textiles, gold dress accessories set with Sri Lankan garnets, and the iconic helmet with human mask. And this is it. It's in the British Museum. It's been reconstructed. And I would ask you to notice that on the center of this mask is in fact the image of a dragon. Here is its tail, right at the mustache, as it were, of the warrior mask. Here are its wings over the eyes, and here are its long head. Is its long head. What this treasure trove shows is the extensive trading networks in which Proto-England was involved, and the ability of a warlord king and his retinue to amass treasures. The find also shows the quality of the work of indigenous artists in ornamentation and jewelry and clothing accessories. Here, for example, is the lid of a purse. The purse itself, being made of cloth, had long since disintegrated in the Suffolk soil, but this splendid piece remains, and I'll show you two. This is one of the details from a lid. Scholars refer to this as Daniel in the lion's den, which may or may not be, but what certainly is the case is it strikes me at least as a kind of wonderfully paranoid fantasy of a human being surrounded by the encroaching presences of monsters. Right? A similar or another part of that same purse lid, if you look closely at this richly intertwined these figures, they're monsters. There's the mouth of one, there's the mouth of the other. Here is their arms going down, and here are their feet coming up. So they're all intertwined, and they're also biting each other's tails, as it were. But again, they represent an image of a world which is intricately bound up with malign forces. Okay. This, on the other hand, is the scepter of the king who was buried there. The bottom part is actually a whetstone, a stone used to sharpen swords. And at the top of it is a totemic image of a deer, the Old English term for which is Herot. And Herot was actually the name of the great hall at the beginning of the poem of Beowulf. And one final example of another totemic animal, a boar's head from the fragmentary remains of a helmet found in the 7th century at Bentigrange. The body that this extraordinary monument was created to hold had long since disintegrated, but contemporary methods of analysis have proved that it was originally there and undoubtedly a royal body, since the currently received dating of the Sutton Hoo burial is in the 620s of the Common Era. The body in question was therefore Redwall's. Several silver artifacts, possibly of Byzantine origin, including bowls with cross motifs and a pair of baptismal spoons, suggest a recollection of Christian practices included within the pagan burial observances, completely in accord with the way Bede describes Redwall, and indicative of Christian-heathen interaction in this transitional period. The dig at Sutton Hoo was interrupted by the beginning of World War II in September 1939 and not resumed until the 1960s. Already in 1939, however, a court ruling awarded the site and its content to Pretty, but she quickly and most generously donated them to the nation. After sheltering in an abandoned tube station during the war, the Sutton Hoo treasures were transferred to the British Museum, where they are now the museum's most visited exhibit. Quite recently, the National Trust opened the site to tourists with replicas of the famous treasures now on display in the Pretty House, remodeled as an exhibition center. Finally, a 2021 Netflix movie, The Dig, starring Ralph Fiennes and Carey Mulligan, and based on a novel of that name, offers a somewhat fictionalized but nonetheless carefully researched account of the Sutton Hoo discovery. I recommend it to you. Proto-England's twin golden age of monasticism and the superior material artistry manifest in the Sutton Hoo ship burial came to an end in the course of the 9th century, curtailed by the near constant pressure of Danish incursions. A pause lasting some decades succeeded the Danes' raid on Lindisfarne and other monastic establishments during the last decades of the 8th century. Annual hit-and-run attacks seeking booty began again in 835, followed in 865 by a full-scale invasion of East Anglia. During this same period, the dynasty traditionally associated with the West Saxons replaced Mercia as the major insular power, and when the Danes finally attacked Wessex in 870, they were met by a strong army that passed under the control of the new king Alfred the following year. By 879, Alfred and his allies had beaten off the Danish onslaught, although the Danes were still able to colonize East Anglia and much of the eastern shore of England. Meanwhile, Alfred, having consolidated his power, began the monumental project of reviving English learning, which had suffered badly during the long decades of battle against the foreign invaders. His goal was to supervise the translation into English prose of many Latin texts that he deemed crucial to his cultural goal. He describes the situation that led him to this program, a description that doubtless idealizes the past, though it may accurately characterize the present, in the preface that he wrote to the English translation of Pope Gregory's manual, Cura Pastoralis, or Pastoral Care. This is what it looks like in manuscript, and you can see at the top, "This book shall to Wiercesser." This book belongs to Worcester. He had these copies of this translation and the preface disseminated through various dioceses around Proto-England. "It has often come to my mind," says Alfred in the preface, "what learned men there were formerly throughout the English nation in both sacred and secular offices, and what happy times these were then throughout this land, and how the kings who had the authority over the people in those days obeyed God and his representatives, and how they maintained their peace and their morality and their authority at home, and also extended their domain abroad," that is, like good warlord rulers, "and how they prospered both in war and learning, and also how zealous the sacred orders were about teaching and learning and all the services they were supposed to perform for God. When I recalled all this, then I remembered how I had seen, before it had all been devastated and burned, that is by the Danish invaders, how the churches throughout this land were filled with treasures and books, and also a great multitude of God's servants, and they got very little benefit from these books, for they could not understand any of them, because they were not written in their own language, that is, in Latin instead of English. Therefore, it seems better to me, if it seems so to you," he says, writing to the bishops, "that we also translate certain books, which may be most necessary for all men to know, into the language that we can all understand, and that we bring it about, as we very easily can with God's help, if we have peace, that young people," that is, the children of the elite, "may be able to be set to studying. Then, among the other various and manifold preoccupations of this kingdom, I began to translate into English this book, which is called in Latin Pastoralis, and in English the Pastor's Book. And I wish to send one copy to each diocese in my kingdom, and in each there will be a bookmark worth 50 mancresses, and in God's name I command that no one take the bookmark from the book, nor the book from the cathedral." I'm using the translation of Robert Diamond, slightly modified. Under Alfred's supervision, teams of scholars translated several foundational Latin works into English prose, thus establishing a standard version of that language, which had taken shape during the latter part of the migration period. Here is an image of the so-called Alfred Jewel, found in Somerset and now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It bears the inscription, "Oxford, Alfred had me made." You can't read it around the edge, it's there. And it may well have been attached to one of the bookmarks that the king mentioned above in his preface. In contrast with Alfred's sponsorship of a new standard English prose, Old English poetry was deeply traditional, based in verse forms that evolved in Germanic Northwestern Europe for public recitation well before the appearance of written language. The basic element of such oral poetry is the line. Here's a line, composed of two halves. Notice the two halves with a large hiatus between them, all right? And the two half lines are bound by alliteration of syllables between the two halves. So that, for example, just looking down to this line, monium methum meo de setla ofteka, the line alliterates across its two halves on the sound and that will be true of all of these lines. That is not on the same sound, but there will be alliteration with one or two parts times in the first part of the first half of the verse, and usually only one in the second half. But it's a thoroughly fixed way of writing. To facilitate its memorization for long public performances, Old English poetry contains a large repertory of formulaic half-lines, descriptive or emotive expressions that can be applied appropriately to a wide range of descriptions or declarations. A perfect example of this would here be Monium Nathan, which means many people. And so you could use that line whenever you were writing about something that involved groups of peoples. You could use that. Young in yardum is a way of describing a young man. He was young in the yards, in the enclosures of a hall. And this was a good half line that you always had available to use if you were describing a young man or a young warrior. And so this is the opening page of Beowulf, the language's greatest extant poem. And just to give you an idea of what that looked like in the only manuscript that we have, this is it. And if one looked at it closely, one would see that the half lines, the lines are not listed separately down one after another. It's all run together as if it were prose, and you can tell how the lines are precisely by following the alliteration. That line, monium meithum medo setla ofteak, is right here, monium meithum medo setla ofteak. But as you can see, they're just written as if they were prose right in the middle. Although the subject matter of such traditional orally declaimed verse was originally heroic, commemorative, or elegiac in nature, rooted in the experience of real or imagined ancestors and the transmitted legends of gods and demigods, during our period, the techniques and vocabulary of pre-literate poetry were adopted to Christian and biblical subjects in poems that, despite their appearance of being oral formulaic utterances, are clearly written compositions, many doubtless of monastic origins. A memorable chapter in the fourth book of Bede's Historia records a charming origin story to account for the rise of a poetry traditional in form, yet Christian and learned in content. As the story goes, in the monastery of Whitby, founded in 657, there was a lay brother called Cadman, whose job it was to care for the monastery's cattle. According to Bede, Cadman so lacked the ability to compose and perform sung traditional poetry that he fled the social occasions where such skills were assumed. Quote, when he saw the harp approaching him, these songs would have been sung to the accompaniment of a small harp, he would rise up in the middle of the feasting, go out and return home, unquote. On one such occasion, on retiring to bed, quote, he dreamt that someone stood by him, saluted him, and called him by name. Cadman, he said, sing me something. To Cadman's admission that he could not sing, his interlocutor counters, nevertheless, you must sing to me. What must I sing, asked Cadman, to be told, sing about the beginning of created things. Cadman began to sing verses which he had never heard before in praise of God the Creator, and Bede paraphrases in Latin the 9 lines of Old English poetry that are now known as Cadman's Hymn, that survive as a freestanding vernacular poem in several manuscripts, as well as in the later Old English translations of Bede's Historia. And here it is. These are the 9 lines of what is now called Cadman's Hymn. And again, it's very much in the form of oral Old English poetry using characteristic half lines and so on. And yet what it's describing is, now must we, as the English translations points out, now must we praise the guardian of the kingdom of heaven, the might of the Creator, the work of the Father of glory, the eternal Lord. He, the holy Creator, first created heaven as a roof for the sons of men, etc., etc. Afterwards prepared the world, the earth for men. So this is according to Bede, what Cadman was told to sing in his dream, and he did. When Cadman awoke, he not only remembered what he had sung in his sleep, but proceeded to add more verses to it. Taken before Whitby's abbess, Hilda, he is made to recite his song for her and for learned monks, all of whom are so impressed that they, quote, read to him a passage of sacred history or doctrine, bidding him make a song out of it if he could in metrical form, unquote. When he returned the next day, having done so, Hilda commanded him to become a monk, and thereafter, until his peaceful death, he was instructed in sacred history and proceeded to create vast amount of Christian poetry. In Bede's telling, Cadman is both a good man who became a good poet and a good poet who became a good monk. His story enacts this equation. Personal inspiration plus monastic vocation equals the conversion of a heathen heroic verse to a new poetry of Christian heroism. A good example of such poetry is the 8th century poem, Dream of the Rood, rood being a word for cross, in which the cross appears to a Christian in a dream and recalls how Christ leapt onto it on Calvary, like a German hero embracing his death in battle. Passages from this poem appear on the Ruthwell Cross, which is what you see before you, one of several very tall preaching crosses still extant, around which Christians gathered for prayer, where no church had yet been constructed. And this is an image of an 8th century Anglo-Saxon church, the one in Bradford-on-Avon in Wiltshire. King Alfred died in 899, and his son Edward and grandsons Athelstan, Edmund, and Edred continued and expanded the dominion of the Wessex dynasty. By 920, Edward had ended Danish hegemony over the eastern parts of the island and achieved authority over Northumbrian, Scottish, and Welsh rulers. In 937, Athelstan and Edmund won an enormous victory at Brunanburg over Norse invaders. However, the failures of leadership and susceptibility to bad advice of a later representative of the dynasty, Athelrad, known by derisive contemporaries as Athelrad Unrad, or Noble Council, No Council, allowed highly trained Scandinavian armies, Norse and later Danish, to make considerable gains against English forces until, after the death of Edmund Ironside, Athelrad's son, in 1016, England succumbed to the rule of Danish kings until 1042, when the crown passed to Edward, later celebrated for his piety as Edward the Confessor, the only surviving son of Athelrad, who, having lived in exile in Normandy, brought back with him to England in 1042 substantial elements of Norman French culture, a fact which makes the arrival of the Normans under William in 1066 a much less clear-cut change of direction than later centuries believed. Again, overlap, mixing, and assimilation mark the end of our period as it did the beginning, and as it does most of human history. Much of what we know about this last century of pre-Norman England comes from the annual entries, often quite extended, of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, or Old English Annals, a consolidation and expansion of several annual chronicles that had been maintained for centuries in various monasteries to record, often quite briefly, the noteworthy events of each year. At some point in the late 890s in Wessex, either Alfred himself or another member of the West Saxon elite began to disseminate an authorized or official summary of each year's events to be distributed to the points of origin of the 7 extant versions of the Chronicle. This material also included the expansion of many earlier annual entries, augmented to make them reflect the portrait of a society governed by heroic values. Because of this ideological inflection, many episodes from Proto-English history recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle are not supported by the recent archaeological discoveries and scientific analyses detailed in the earlier part of my remarks, and can therefore be said to have contributed to the misconceptions of earlier scholars about the crucial role of Anglo-Saxon war bands in the development of 5th century post-Roman Britain. Here's an image of a page from one of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles in the original Old English, and of course translated on this side. And just to give you an idea of the way they spoke, if they talk about Hengist and Horsa, the 2 leaders of the Anglo-Saxon, who fought against the Britons And for example, year 457, which is here. Here, Hengist and Ashe fought against the Britons at a place, at a place called Craigsford, which may be Crayford in Kent, and there slew 4,000 men, and the Britons then forsook Kent and fled to London in great terror. That's the kind of thing that you read there. A similar ideological nostalgia, as we might call it, is observable in the otherwise contemporary reporting of 10th and 11th century events involving the campaigns against Danish and Norse invaders. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 937, or it should be 939, recounting entirely and uniquely in Old English heroic Romaic verse the aforementioned battle between the English and the Norse soldiers at Brunanburg, offers the most striking instance of this nostalgia, which reshapes the encounter to accord with the values of the Germanic tradition of war poetry, enshrined in its formulaic expressions and striking metaphors known as kenning. I don't expect you, of course, to read that, and so I'll just read to you the first 5 lines of the Battle of Brunanburg. Here King Athelstan, lord of nobles, ring giver of men, and his brother also, Prince Edmund, won in battle lifelong glory with the edges of their swords at Brunanburg. That's very much a kind of heroic poetry. Herr Athelstan König, Erle Drichten, Björne Bergjefa, and his brother H, Edmund Athelinga, Elder lange tier geslogen at sacha swerde edgem imba Brunanburg. As I say, it's the only entry in all of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that's in heroic verse, and it's a verse that clearly refers backwards to an imagined Anglo-Saxon heroic age. The behavior of the victors is specifically exclaimed as fitting to them from their ancestors, and the poem concludes in a rash of hyperbole. Never yet before this had there been a greater slaughter on this island of an armed force laid low by the edge of the sword, according to what books tell us, old scholars, since the Angles and Saxons came ashore from the east, came over the broad sea to Britain, proud warsmiths overcame the Welas, the Britons, glorious heroes seized the country, unquote. And with this final salute to an invasion that we now know never happened, at least not like that, and to a heroic glory that we must therefore abandon in favor of those frustratingly messy but profoundly human facts on the ground, we have come full circle. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Professor Hanning. We have time for a couple of questions before we begin to wrap up tonight's program. So I will go ahead and read out some questions that have been shared. Our first question comes from Jeffrey Baldwin. He is asking, Saxon monarchies were elective, but who were the types of people who could vote? And what percentage of the population made up the voters? Or did the voters make up? Excuse me.
Yeah. Those are questions that I'm certainly not able to answer. I'll say that flat out. The notion that the monarchies were elective would presumably have meant, for a good part of the period that we're talking about, that a very small proportion of the people actually living under what I've been calling a warlord or warlord becoming king would have been able, in fact, to cast a vote or support a particular candidate. And of course, the point is that it was a familial structure, and although there wasn't anything like primogeniture, it was the case normally that the rule of a kingdom would be passed on within the ruling family, and the people who might choose among, if there were more than one candidate from within that ruling family, it would presumably be the cohort, the close surrounding cohort of the ruler who would have done the choice. It certainly would hardly not have been in terms of casting secret ballots. I don't know enough about this. There are a lot of things I don't know enough about, but I can say pretty securely that certainly at their beginnings, in the period that I refer to as the warlord period, it was really the way warlords worked, that a single person who could surround himself with a group of people whom he rewarded in various ways for their service were able to enforce, as we see, once they were able to get sharpened weapons, were able to enforce superiority and exploitation of resources. This is very important to understand, from the people around them, which in the beginning would have been very small groups indeed. But I certainly not for much of the period that we're talking about was anything like a large electorate available. People were too far away, if not necessarily in geographical or topographical terms, but in terms of the distance between the elite and the people, the peasantry, what you wanted, the serfdom, whatever you wanted to call them, the people who provided the material which was exploited by the people who had the control. Those people who were the producers, if you will, were not the voters. That part I can be sure of. Beyond that, I have to take a pass on that one. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. All right, and then our next and final question of the night comes from Charles Lumpkins with the Central Pennsylvania branch. They are wondering, how did the Anglo-Saxons and other populations overcome their tendencies of remaining a polyglot population in order to forge the English language from several other languages?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Of course, of
I
course.
want to make sure I get it right. Yeah, please
No
repeat
problem.
it, Elizabeth.
Yes. So Charles Lumpkins is asking, how did the Anglo-Saxons and other populations of the time, how did they overcome their historical tendencies of being a polyglot population? And how did that result in the English language as we know it, that was formed from several other languages?
Good. That's an excellent question. And of course, we don't have records that make this clear. What we do know is that the earliest records that we do have, all of which, of course, tend to postdate the events that they're talking about, refer to the people as in Latin as Angli, or in Old English as English, and the language that they were speaking was English. And unfortunately, it is frankly absolutely impossible to know how that language actually took the form it did. I mean, I'm relying here, as I've had for much of what I've said tonight, on the most recent work. And the most recent work is in fact very vague on that question. What is clear is that in its earliest forms, the language that became English did have, it was basically a Germanic language, there's no doubt about that. It contained fairly large loans or component parts of words that were based on Britain, which is Celtic words, also Frankish words from across the channel, and Latin as well. So one has to assume, as one does with languages generally, that and English specifically, that consolidations of imports, if you will, are gradually brought in. I mean, the situation with respect to English, the English language after the Norman conquest, of course, you have a new French-speaking elite imposed on the top of a social and political structure that was much of which, or at least the clerical part of which, were Latin speaking. And the rest were speaking from birth, of course, English. And then they had to deal with French, and it took a few centuries for that to happen, so that by the time you get to something like the English that we're used to, which is chock-a-block with French words, that took a while for it to sort of percolate down into the the population at large. And it would do so in a variety of different ways. It would do so through face-to-face conversations necessary between people of different statuses and so on, and people of different ethnic groups. I mean, you'd have Creoles develop. You'd have various cross breeds, if you will, and gradually out of that, having to do with who had the most power, obviously, but not exclusively that way, certain forms would become the dominant forms. And we only know that happens, you know, we can see it happening later in the late Middle Ages, say with respect to French and so on, but it's always a somewhat mysterious process what choices are made. To take the most famous example, our word egg is not a word that is actually descended from the Old English word for egg. It's a Norse word. So, and therefore was a word that came into the English language from the north, where the Norse and Danish influence was stronger because of their settlements there, the so-called Danelaw. But why that word, as opposed to several others, became standard English, replacing a perfectly appropriate Old English word, we have no way of knowing. So there are great mysteries about this, and it would be awfully nice to be able to know, to have philologists and students of language on the ground while this was happening. But unfortunately, we don't. Certainly not for the period that we're talking about here, the period between the departure of the Romans and this first establishment of something that could call themselves kingdoms. I wish I could be more specific about that, but that is one of the language acquisition and language formation tends to be a great mystery in a lot of ways.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Hayden.
Sure.
For that wonderful answer. And thank you to everyone for the questions that you submitted. I'm now going to turn it back over to Dr. Karen Blair Brandt, and she is going to say a few words and close us out for the evening.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Professor Hanning, thank you for a wonderful and interesting program today. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's ESU Happy Hour. Again, thank you to the ESU Monmouth County branch and Dr. Ralph Windrum for sponsoring today's happy hour. I would also like to take a minute and acknowledge our ESU Grassroots Happy Hour Committee members for their work. Gideon McQuay from the Seattle branch, Barbara Hughes from Central Florida, Julie Jardine from New Orleans branch, Bill Kennedy from the Cleveland branch, Jeff Schnabel from the Kansas City branch, and Elizabeth Bigelow from our New York City headquarters, national headquarters for the ESU. Thank all of you for all your work and what you all do with all the work we do to bring our branches and our programs to our members, guests, and friends of the ESU. I would also like to thank our Executive Director, Karen Karpowitz, and our Chairman, Dr. Quinn Pieper, for giving us this opportunity to provide this grassroots effort to our members, guests, and friends. The ESU is a membership organization, and we hope that you will become a member if you are not already a member. Our next ESU Happy Hour will be December 14th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will be brought to us by Jim Stebbings from the UK, and it will be the English pantomime, and so it'll have a little bit of a holiday flair to it. You can read more about it at esus.org. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Elizabeth and crew in New York City, for doing all the background work to help us bring these programs to our members, friends, and guests. Thank you, Professor Hanning, again. Good night, everyone.